I think that's an important point, is that, as Frank's making, we don't know what happened, but we've actually, many of us have written letters to our congressmen with problems, and the answer we always get back is that the 9/11 Commission did a great job, and I recently wrote one about there's been a lot of new evidence that's come out, and in other crimes, if there's new evidence that shows something contrary to what has been told, then usually that's checked into. And the response to this particular congressman was that the majority of the evidence still supports the official story. Well, the problem is that's not even remotely close to the truth right now. The majority of the evidence does not support the official story. There's a very, very small amount of evidence that supports the official story. There probably never was a majority, but every day and every week we learn more things about the official story that aren't true, from forensics, from eyewitnesses, from just things that keep being uncovered, just like this report 2 days ago about the military exercise. It's not adding to the credibility. There's nothing that's come out really that's added to the credibility of the official story. But like Frank said, that it's possible some of these guys were on the planes, but they didn't have the wherewithal to pull off this incredible crime. I mean, it's the lone gunman theory kind of expanded that is used in a lot of crimes, that just a small group of people did it, nobody could have helped them. And in this particular crime, it's just not possible. People say, well, the Bush administration couldn't have done it, and of course we're not necessarily implying that, because they're too stupid. But these 19 guys are smarter than our whole, United States military intelligence. That doesn't make any sense. Why? So a lot of the arguments that have been used just don't make any sense. But there's a lot of questions that need to be answered.
Yeah, I think, and Frank mentioned that if you do an analysis of a crime, you need to supply the means. That is to say, the suspect has to be someone who has access to the means. And the key means here for these hijackers would have been the ability to fly commercial airliners. And the Venice, Florida flight schools indicated that, first of all, they only trained in very small planes. And second, they couldn't fly these planes at all well. And then to assume that they could somehow take this experience and extrapolate it into the cockpit of a commercial airline where they had no in-air experience whatsoever in such planes. There was a short period in which they did take a few hours of training in a kind of a ground facsimile simulator. But even in that point, they were said to have not done very well, and one needs hundreds of hours of training to be a credible pilot. And not only did whoever flew these planes, or however they were flown, not only did they effectively flown, but they were flown in an extremely competent way. That is to say, to hit the Pentagon, to hit structures at 400 plus miles per hour, is said to be, by folks who know much more than I do, very, very difficult. Very, very difficult for commercial airline pilots, even for fighter aircraft pilots. And yet these folks who had no human capacity to fly these planes were said to have actually accomplished this. So the theory, the narrative just doesn't hold water.
So we recognize that the pilot flying into the Pentagon, it would have been very hard, probably impossible for him to have done it. But then let's now think about the plane. The plane had these two big engines on each wing. We know that from the official report, I think. And in fact, the engines would be the heaviest part of the plane. But right after the Pentagon was hit, there were pictures on TV, and you could see the hole that the plane went through. Wouldn't you expect two holes for the engines? There are no holes for the engines. They never found the engines, I don't think. So isn't that interesting that we have a pilot that couldn't have flown the plane in, and then we have no holes for a plane that supposedly flew in?
There are a lot of problems with the whole Pentagon story, and again, I don't claim to know what happened, but there are problems that need investigation, and I know Pete and I have discussed this at length. Starting from the beginning, you know, what we have with the Pentagon is we have, I believe it was Flight 77, was coming in from the west to Washington, and you would think that the simplest thing to do would be to dive straight down into the roof of the Pentagon and be sure of hitting a big target, but that's not what happened. Whoever was flying this plane, apparently, it's on radar, did this really incredible maneuver in which they came from the west, they turned around 270 degrees at a high rate of speed and a high rate of descent, which many pilots have indicated is either impossible or close to impossible, even for a very well-experienced pilot. And then after doing this, it hits the side of the Pentagon, you know, and the Pentagon's, what, 40 feet high or something like that, at over 400 miles per hour, which again, many pilots have said is impossible. There's no footage of this happening. The one piece of footage that we've seen does not show a 757 hitting the Pentagon. It shows something hitting the Pentagon. We don't know what. And then on top of that, and the extraordinary thing about all this is, I'm assuming most of you watching this program don't know a thing about this because it is not being reported. But on top of all that, we have the flight data recorder data allegedly, that's what it is, supplied by the NTSB, the agency that investigates these accidents. They supplied it to the 9/11 Commission. And if you look at this data, there's a group of pilots, it's Pilots for 9/11 Truth. They've analyzed this data and they said, wait, according to this data, the plane was too high to have hit the Pentagon. So according to them then, it flew over the Pentagon. Apparently at the same time there was an explosion leading witnesses to believe that there had been a crash of this plane when probably there hadn't been, at least not according to the flight data recorder supplied by the NTSB. And then on top of that, we have a large number of witnesses who've been interviewed who have no stake in this except that they can damage their career forever by coming forward, but they do. And they have said that they saw this 757 approaching the Pentagon on a path that was completely inconsistent with the damage done at the Pentagon and with the damage to the light poles in the path up to the Pentagon. Very credible witnesses, most of whom are government employees, who one would think, if anything, would say nothing about it. In fact, when they were given these interviews or testifying, I don't think many of them understood the import of what they were saying, but they were very clear on where this plane was coming from. It was coming from a northerly direction, not a southwesterly or southeasterly direction. That would have had to have been the case. So, I mean, yeah, the alleged terrorists, hijackers, could not fly this plane. The maneuver was either difficult or perhaps impossible and made no sense because it hit the wing that was most fortified, furthest away from the high brass of the military and Rumsfeld's office. And we have all these witnesses saying it's on the wrong path, and we have the flight data recorder saying it's too high. And there's a witness who actually does say he saw, Pete, I'm sure you remember this, there's at least one witness who says, yes, he did see a 757 flying away from the Pentagon at that time. So you add it all up, and what do you get? For me, you get, we need an investigation.
It's interesting, as Frank pointed out, to note the area of the Pentagon that was hit. This was an area which had just been rebuilt, and it had been hardened to make it more secure. And so possibly they needed an experiment to see if they had designed it well so that it really was secure. But it also didn't have a whole lot of people in it. And it was well removed from Cheney's office. So it was a nice place for them to...
Rumsfeld's office.
Rumsfeld's office, and also whatever other offices, the important people's offices. So nobody important would get killed. And so they had a motive there to experiment and see if this hardened, rebuilt area of the Pentagon would withstand a hit. And lo and behold, they get a hit. It's the same as the Trade Center now. There was an asbestos problem there, and those buildings were white elephants. And how do you bring down the cost of taking the asbestos out of those buildings? Does anybody remember that, the estimates of the cost of the asbestos? And it was very convenient that they get demolished, and nobody has to worry about paying for the removal of the asbestos. In fact, the insurance companies paid reimburse them for the value of the building, not taking into account that the buildings were probably worth nothing.